My name is Ali Mirsapasi. I am a faculty member at New York University and the director of Iranian Studies Initiative. Thank you everyone for joining us for what I am sure will be a very, very interesting and exciting discussion. I'm also delighted to say that we are celebrating a member of our own department and for a very happy occasion. We are here to both celebrate and discuss Arash Azizi's new book. Arash writes extensively. There isn't a week that I hear that he published something, but I believe this is his first book-size publication. And the book is a very timely a study of Qassem Soleimani and US and Iran relationship. The book's title is The Shadow Commander Soleimani, the US and Iran's Global Ambitions. The book was published a few months ago, late 2020 by One World Press based in London. The author, Arash Azizi, is a PhD candidate in Middle Eastern Studies and History at NYU. Arash works on social history and of socialist and Islamist movements in the Middle East, Iran, and the Arab world, and their role in the making of the global 60s and Cold War period. Basically covers something that usually 5 or 6 PhD students works in. We are very, very curious and excited to see your future work. As many of you probably already know, Arash is also a journalist and writes on history and culture and politics on an almost daily basis. I'm also delighted to have a longtime friend and a senior scholar of Iranian studies, Mehrzad Boroujerdi, who is joining us and will be the discussant of our today's event. Professor Boroujerdi is the director of the School of Public and International Relations at Virginia Tech. But many of us know Mehrzad as a professor of political science at Syracuse University for a very, very long time. I believe he was at Syracuse from 1992 to 2019. Mehrzad's latest book, a fantastic book and a fantastic research reference, is the Iranian, is the Post-Revolutionary Iran, a Political Handbook, very straightforward title. This book was also published recently. It was published by Syracuse University in 2018. Mehrzad's very important and well-known book was the Iranian Intellectuals and the West. That book also was published by Syracuse University very early in his career in 1996. Mehrzad has written and edited books and many, a large number of articles, but I just wanted to briefly introduce him here and not take so much of their time. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Arash and Mehrzad, for agreeing and being here, and I look forward to your talks. Go ahead, Arash.
Thank you so much, Professor Mirsapasi, and thank you very much, everyone, for being here. It's a real honor, and thank you, everyone, for attending. So I'll give a brief sort of a story of the book. As you said, let me start by saying, I was working on the book before. It wasn't like Soleimani got killed, and I was like, oh, that's great. Let's try the book in a few months. Although I don't know whether that's possible, but so let me start by saying, why is it that the figure of Soleimani had fascinated me a long time before? And I'm fortunate that my publisher, sort of Novin Dustar, is here. So if he could confirm, he could confirm this account if I said something out of line. But the reality is, I had a fascination with Soleimani for a long time before, for two primary reasons that I'll get to. And when Mehrzad Boroujerdi raised the issue that he was looking for someone to write a book on him, I sort of tried to nominate myself, and I was researching the book for a couple of years before Soleimani's killing in January 2020, and after that, Novin was kind enough to sort of trust me, with the contract for the book, and we were able to finish it with a very hard work of the publication house in this sort of expedited manner. But the research was going on for a while. Now, what are the two reasons that sort of made me have an interest in Soleimani when I was sort of in my journalistic career, and then into my sort of scholarly research as well? So as you mentioned earlier, my scholarly research focuses on basically the links between Iranian and Arab revolutionaries in this, what we call the long 60s, 1968 to 1979. The two might seem very unconnected together, sort of Soleimani and this period, but there is actually there is actually a conceptual link, and of course some actual historical links. First, I'm long interested in the issue of, let's call it, transnationalism or internationalism. In simpler words, how is it that figures from a country are able to play important roles in the histories of other countries, and that how is it that their primary that their motivations and their ideas can be formed in this transnational manner. And in the 20th century, I am interested in the history of Marxism and socialism. Obviously, Marxism and socialism planted its flag on having a global identity and internationalism. But it was, for me, it was something of an irony that the Islamic Republic, a right-wing reactionary regime that it is, also had a very internationalist project in Soleimani, who after all was someone who was able to recruit Afghans and Pakistanis commanded by Iranians to go fight and die in wars in Syria. It was a phenomenon that interested me, of how was it and what was the nature of this Islamic Republic's internationalism? What connection did it have to Islamist revolutionaries before 1979? And how did the internationalism turned from what was at the beginning of the revolution, sort of a hopeful, cosmopolitan even vision on parts of some at least, to what at the time of Soleimani became a sectarian and frankly actually nationalist international project in many ways. So this fascinated me. And the other interlinking question is the question of the relations between Iran and the Arab world that fascinated me for a long time. It starts with the lament that, why is it that the intellectual and political cultures in Iran and the Arab world have relatively few links to each other? Iran being an Islamic Republic and all that, still about 2% of all books translated to Persian are from Arabic. If Sadegh Hedayat is well known in Turkey and Egypt, it is because he was first translated to French. We didn't have very serious links between the cultural fields, and even on the left, there used to be some links in the 60s and 70s, but much less in the last 40 years. So this lament had meant that I was always interested, how is it, what are the links, what are the ways we were connected and disconnected on the left and in the sort of cultural artistic field that I associate with the left. And how is it that on the other side, if you will, there were such extensive connections, and how is it that the main story of Iran and the Arab world today is the IRGC and Soleimani? And so my undergrad was in transnational studies. My master's studies in Free University of Berlin was in global history. So I've followed this trend of thought for a long time in sort of different transnational, international questions. And at NYU, I was very fortunate. I think it's, not to toot our horn too much, but it's one of the best places to do this kind of work because most of the faculty that I had the pleasure of working with do cross these national boundaries in very interesting ways. Professor Mirzapaz's seminar here, for example, was on the question of Iranian intellectual history and it's called actually At Home and in the World, where among others, we discussed Professor Boroujerdi's book on the tormented triumph of nativism in Iran. So this is just one of the classes in which every single class actually is about transnational links, basically. Whether with the East, let's say India, whether the West, Western Europe, or closer Arab countries. And other classes in NYU also helped in a similar way. Professor Persley's class on border and borderlands, look at a lot at, for that class, I actually wrote about Iran and Iraq and the links between IRGC and some Iraqi Kurdish groups, which make it directly to the book. And Professor Lockman, whose approach of relationalism of the relations between, in this case, one of his very well-known books, Comrades and Enemies, about Arabs and Jews in Mandatory Palestine, adopts this relationalist approach that I have hoped to adopt from my scholarly work and basically look at the relations of different groups in that case, sort of in my case, it's sort of Iranians and Arabs, and how is it that what happens when we study their history in relation with each other. And even in the early modern period, we have Aisha Baltachi-Brammer in our department, which look at early modern period, 16th century, and the way Safavids and Ottomans sort of made each other. So if I say the real sort of intellectual hope that I have with the project is this call for a relational study, and a study that doesn't just compare the experiences of Iran and the Arab world, as important as they are, but ask the question of what happens when we look at the links and the entanglements and the transnational roles that figures in all of these histories play. Now, in the career of Soleimani and in the career of Islamic Republic, I think we have a great topic to study this. So I'll basically conclude here, and the last word I'd say is that I love biographies, and I hope we could have more biographies in our field. This is not a full-on biography, of course, but what I have tried humbly to do is to use the career of Soleimani to tell a story of Iran's relations with the Arab world in the last 40 years. And also the internationalism, or if you will, international activities of the Islamic Republic, which are unique in their own way.
Thank you so much, Arash. Mehrzad.
Well, first of all, let me also thank Dr. Mirzapazhi, Arash, and everyone at NYU for this opportunity to be with you here today. To discuss this really, really interesting book. Let me try to jump in right away discussing it. First of all, let me say that even though Arash says in the introduction of his book that this is the story of a man and his rise to power, I came away from reading it thinking that this was really much more than a simple biography of one important, no matter how consequential the gentleman was. It is really in many ways the history of modern Middle East from, I guess, the perspective of someone who has lived there and really knows it. So let me first start with what I consider to be as the positive features of the book before talking about the controversial subject matter of the book. I should say that in reading this 290 page book, I was really convinced that Arash is a master storyteller. The writing is very elegant. The language is very accessible. He manages to carry his transitions across topics really well. So this is really a page turner in my view. And even on occasions, excuse me, when he digresses, even the digressions are really quite interesting. There are digressions into American or Iranian literature, for example, that manifest themselves in the pages of the book. Another thing that I thought, for a book of this sort is really needed, considering the audience, is that the book is really totally devoid of high theory jargon, and therefore, is really accessible there. What the reader gathers from reading this book is that the fact that the author really has a wonderful command of the events and personalities in various countries, not just in Iran, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Israel, in the US. So people like Arafat, Saddam, Ataturk, Imam Musa Sadr, and others, make an appearance in the book, and they're really nicely situated in their historical context. So you come away with an understanding of the significance of this individual. Of course, he also needed to know intimately well the history of the Iran-Iraq war, since much of the book really deals with what Soleimani was doing in the course of the war, and surely his place of birth and upbringing, Kerman and the Kermani. So these are really some of the interesting things that are in the book. I mentioned some interesting sections. There is one in particular that I want to highlight, but I don't want to spoil it for those who wish to read the book themselves. There is an exchange between Saddam Hussein and an early Iranian foreign minister, Ebrahim Yazdi, that is really remarkable when you read it, in terms of getting a sense, understanding of the power politics and how each side that was to engage in an 8-year war, what was happening in their heads right before the conflict started. So treat yourself to that section of the book. Now, coming to the subject matter here, of course, the subject matter of this book is an important general. Let me say the following. Some years back, I remember walking into the halls of a US government agency and encountered a real size cardboard of Qassem Soleimani. I don't know whether it was for target shooting or for what, but he was there reminding the audience about his significance. And it's not just in the US that he was taken seriously. Of course, this is the man who received the second most memorable funeral in Iran after no other than Ayatollah Khomeini himself, right? A man who was, more not only in Iran, but in Iraq, Lebanon, and Afghanistan. And so we get a sense, speaking of transnational ties, of what was really involved here. As if to emphasize the significance of his subject matter, Arash, reminds the reader that Khamenei's appointment of Qassem Soleimani was the most consequential appointment of Khamenei's life, right? And he also refers to the Quds force, the Jerusalem force that Soleimani led for the last 22 years of his life, as the most consequential militia in the history of the Middle East, and also as the most ambitious expeditionary army in the history of the modern Middle East. So if you notice, he uses the word most 3 times in describing the man and the force that he was leading, again, as a way of convincing the reader why the subject matter is important. And of course he was. I mean, he was one of the few that Ayatollah Khamenei has referred to as a living martyr back in 2005. And Soleimani is the man who to this day has received the highest military medal in Iran's history, after the revolution. So I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that we are talking about a man who can most probably accurately be perceived as the most feared Iranian general of the last half a century. A man who, basically spent 41 years of his 65 years, or 62 years, or 65% of his life in war and conflict, and really developed a rather encyclopedic knowledge of the landscape of various conflicts in this region, and of course a man who managed to mastermind some important battlefield victories for Iran in such theaters of operation as Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, etc. Now, what is really amazing when you think about it is the following. All of this from a gentleman who had no post-secondary education, who was working in a regional water department at the time of the Iranian Revolution, who entered the Iran-Iraq War, not having set foot anywhere outside Iran, and also having zero military experience, right? So you ask yourself, what happened in the lifespan of Soleimani that a person from, with this type of a background managed to be such a world important figure in this way. As we all know, and I don't expect anyone to contest this assertion, we are talking about a controversial individual. For many, he is considered to be a national hero, and in the eyes of equal others, he is considered to be a monster, a bad person. And I think there is enough evidence in the book to really give you this Janus face of Qassem Soleimani. So let me start with the affable general, right? The first view. Again, something that comes across in the book is that this man who was born in 1956 from very humble rural backgrounds, who loved karate before the revolution, and is only 22 at the time of the 1979 revolution, really comes across as an extremely brave individual, as a hands-on commander, right? Not one who stands, behind the soldiers and say, lead, but one that, personally is on the forefront. A man who is known by his friends and nemesis alike that for his camaraderie treatment of soldiers. And therefore, people who worked with him apparently really liked it. Very good at mobilizing and also very, very ambitious. The book, reveals some interesting stuff about Soleimani. Again, most of us might not have been aware of this, that when he first applied to join the IRGC, his application was rejected, perhaps because the day he showed up, he was in short sleeves, right? And was not considered to be religious enough. And then he applied again a year later, and this time was admitted. This is now May of 1980. Now he's around 24 years old. And the date is very interesting. This second time when he was admitted, this happened 8 days after the failed American rescue mission to get the hostages back, even though Arash doesn't mention this in the book, but the timing I thought was quite interesting. And of course, 4 months into his service in the IRGC, the Iran-Iraq War starts. And speaking of the war, of course, we learn about how Qassem Soleimani was badly injured in the war more than once. We learn about some of the intriguing tactics, for example, that he employed to fool the Iraqis. So, for example, having a caravan of military trucks without any soldiers in them, heading in a direction to give the impression that there were, hundreds, if not thousands, of Iranian soldiers, about to attack. So, you read about this type of, brilliant tactics by a military, general. We learn about his pragmatic side, right? That both in 2001 and in 2015, he collaborated with American forces, first against the Taliban in Afghanistan, and then against ISIS in Iraq. So this portrayal of Soleimani as sort of this hardcore man who was not, who hated the Americans, etc., I don't think, holds up to closer scrutiny. We read about his efforts in organizing the Afghan opposition to the Taliban with Ahmad Shah Massoud and others. Another interesting part for me, for example, that I didn't know about was how he was there in Lebanon in the midst of the 2006 war with Israel, and at a time when Hezbollah's leader, Nasrallah, is really frightened about what might be happening. It is Soleimani who is basically consoling him and saying, hold of yourself, there are better days ahead in that regard. Or, this is the same gentleman who flies into an Iraqi city surrounded by the ISIS forces, again, to demonstrate his philosophy about how he needed to be at the center of the operations to be really leading his men. On the other hand, as I said, there is also this Soleimani the monster image that is also, can be valid here. This is a man who, let's start with domestic politics of Iran, right? This is a man who, a year after he was appointed the commander of the Quds Force in 1998, that happened. In 1999, Soleimani plays a crucial role in drafting a very threatening letter to Iran's president, Mohammad Khatami, basically demanding a harsher crackdown on a student protester at Tehran University. And by some accounts, apparently he played a key role in even the drafting and writing of this threatening letter. He is a man who also denounced the 2009 Green Movement in Iran, a state silent on the house arrest of the leaders of the Green Movement, supported his buddy, his military buddy, Ghalibaf, both in the 2005 and 2009 presidential runs, unsuccessful, of course, of Mr. Ghalibaf. This is the same man who attacks reformists in 2018, right? So, in other words, on the domestic front, there is a lot that one can object to in terms of Soleimani's performance and, clearly tying himself with the more conservative elements in the country. On the international front, also, there is a lot to think about. Soleimani was listed as a terrorist in a March 2007 UN Security Council resolution. He was the source of the roadside bombs bedeviling American forces in Iraq. Arash tells us that Kataib Hezbollah was his brainchild, and that, helping to form Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq, the mobilization force, again, was one of his ideas based on the sample of IRGC in Iran. So the book talks about how Soleimani was less than truthful on many occasions, and he fanned the flames of sectarianism in places like Iraq by really emphasizing the Shiite component of the identity. We are also told, and I think rightfully so, that Soleimani sided with Assad and was involved in the killing of the Syrians before the whole ISIS thing began. So justifying him on moral grounds that he was only fighting the ISIS folks in Syria, again, is not factually accurate. We also learn about other things. For example, how he trained the Houthis in Yemen. And actually, according to Arash, he has a Houthi sniper killed the former Yemeni president Saleh, assassinate him there. Or that he orders his men to meet with drug cartels in Mexico for someone who turned out to be a informant, etc. I think what comes across for me, at least, is I'm not sure whether I should call it exactly confidence or arrogance, but perhaps a combination of the two. Qassem Soleimani, as we know, is a man who threatens Bahrain's king that he can overthrow him. He warns Pakistani government about what you do on the borders. He is the one who threatens US General Petraeus in 2007 by basically telling him, and I'm quoting here, I control Iran's policy in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, and Afghanistan. In other words, if you're interested in resolving any of these things, talk to me. He is the one who, shortly before his death, called President Trump, gambler Trump, you have to deal with me. And of course, Trump returned the favor by assassinating him. Soleimani also is the one, as we know, who really usurped the power of the Iranian foreign minister, not only by appointing his buddies, his men, as ambassadors to various Arab countries, Iraq, Syria, you name it, but also he was the one who brought Bashar al-Assad to Iran in February of 2019 without necessarily bothering to inform the foreign minister, which, as you may remember, led Zarif to turn in his resignation, saying, so who am I here? What am I worth if somebody like Assad comes to Iran and I don't know about this? Ryan Crocker, one of the America's most experienced diplomat, who negotiated on more than one occasion with Soleimani and his men, had the following to say when he was killed. He said, Qassem Soleimani allowed his ego to overcome his judgment. And I think Crocker might have gotten it right in terms of Soleimani becoming more arrogant. According to Arash, again, he was even considering a presidential run and had his boys consider the possibility of a presidential run for himself. Okay, now let me turn to some more critical comments. So I don't think Arash's book is by any means yet another uncritical biography or a hagiography of an important personality. But I would say, I think unfortunately, like other biographies, it might be suffering from problems that we know of biographies to begin with, right? As we know, biographies more often than not suffer from aggrandizement tendencies as they try to paint their subjects in an overtly positive light, sort of men and women of virtue, people of extraordinary accomplishments, sort of larger than life figures, etc. So rightfully so, we are often told to treat biographies with a grain of salt, right, in regard to the personal biases, the passionate convictions, the judgmental assertions, the affected prose that is often the stuff of biographies. After all, somebody smarter than me once said there are only three kinds of memories: good, bad, and convenient. And convenience seems to play itself out a lot in the writings of many biographies. So what might be some weaknesses in the book? Again, as I said, there is a lot to appreciate and celebrate in this book. But if I were to put on my hat as a critic, there are some things that I wished Arash had addressed in more detail. First and foremost, the impact of Soleimani on Iran's domestic politics is really not much discussed. And I think that's a shame because, as I mentioned, Soleimani becomes the commander of the Quds Force in 1998. That is the date in which he was appointed, comes 18 days exactly after President Khatami had his famous interview with Christian Amanpour of CNN, right, about the dialogue of civilization, etc. So in other words, for 7 years of the time that Khatami was president, Qassem Soleimani is running the Quds Force. And we don't get much about, what was happening there. How did the operations that Soleimani was masterminding around the world interfered or undermined, right, the efforts of a reformist president who had come in to power in Iran with a great deal of hope. The second part is, and again, I like to, for Arash to correct me. I don't think this assertion is correct, but I want to make sure that I am right on that regard. So Qassem Soleimani, was involved in the Quds Force and IRGC, as we said, from the early 1980s. Did he play any role, even a small role, in some of the assassination of Iranian leaders overseas. And I'm referring to the ones who were assassinated before he became the commander of the Quds Force. For example, Qassem Lu in 1989, Kazem Rajavi in 1990, Shapur Bakhtiar in 1991, Sharaf Gandhi in 92, et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to know what the story is if he has that knowledge. I also wonder, what role did Soleimani play, if any, again, in the 1996 Khobar tower bombings in Saudi Arabia, or perhaps more importantly, in the 2005 assassination of Rafiq Hariri, another gentleman who is mentioned in the book and whose, the place of assassination I visited in Beirut, some years back. But, was Soleimani involved in that important event in Lebanese, history? Are there any truth to the arguments that Soleimani and his men were involved in smuggling operations in Baluchistan and Iraq, in dealing with the Taliban, in abductions that happened, in these border towns, etc.? We don't see any of those things in the book. The portrait of Soleimani as the brilliant general also doesn't answer some of the nagging questions I had. For example, so if this man with his encyclopedic knowledge of Iraq knows every player, has been on the ground since 1980, how is it that he did not see the emergence of ISIS in 2003 or its ransacking of Mosul in 2014 or their attack on the Iranian Majlis in 2017, right? So 3 important events that happened under his nose, and you would expect somebody with his type of expertise to have known about these things there. Again, the portrait of this brilliant general can be contested when you see that since 2017 at least, Israel has been hitting his men and Quds Force forces in places like Syria repeatedly, right? By some account, over 2,000 sorties have happened over Syrian border, attacking Iranian soldiers. And really, there has been no response on the part of the Iranians, no serious response to speak of. So my question that I have are of this sort. And again, I wish if there is a second edition that perhaps Arash can add some of these things to the book. How much of the political debacles Iran is facing today really should be attributed to the arrogant daydreams of Qassem Soleimani? How responsible is he for Iran's financial difficulties, either in the shape of money he gave to the militias or the sanctions he brought upon Iran due to his interferences in internal affairs of the country? And just 3 really, really minor, and again, this is no criticism, but really minor thing that I hope gets corrected in the next edition in terms of factual inaccuracies. Ebrahim Yazdi, Arash, he was a pharmacologist, not a chemistry professor. Ali Akbar Velayati did not actually get a medical degree from Johns Hopkins. He had done a short training at Hopkins. This I know based on calling Johns Hopkins University and verifying the information for the book that Ali mentioned. And also on Ismail Qaani that you mentioned is few months younger than Qassem Soleimani. It's really 1.5 years age difference between the two. So let me conclude again in the interest of time by saying the following. I think what, if you ask me what is the specific contribution of this book, I would say this is a book that really situates the rise of Soleimani in the context of what's happening in the MENA region and does a very nice job of bringing the individuals to life and contextualizing for a reader that might not know the complicated history and nuances of the Middle East. How are these elements really intertwined, right? How is it that a Sadr family can be important in Lebanon, Iraq, as well as Iran, for example? this is the book does, and it does it in a fantastic way. You will come away from this book, I think, still undecided whether Soleimani was that brilliant Iranian military hero or an obedient servant of a nasty regime. Okay, because there is enough food for thought to verify either one of those assertions. There is a Greek saying which I was thinking about as I read this book. It goes like this: war is an evil in as much as it produces more wicked men than it takes away. And that might be appropriate in this case here. Without the shadow of a doubt, Qassem Soleimani was both a shadow commander and a member of a shadow government known as IRGC. In my view, that is his legacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Boroujerdi. This was a really generous comments. Thank you very much. And thank you for correcting the mistakes. For sure, I'll look at them for the second edition that, I try to pressure my publisher for the paperback edition that's coming in a few months to do them, and fantastic contributions that I'll address. Before, I should say that early on when I was talking about the intellectual sources at NYU that were important for the book, I of course also meant to mention Professor Arash Azizi and his new project really on the Persian Gulf, which there are some students that try to connect the societies of Persian Gulf, both Arab and Iranian, which has obviously been an inspiration, as well as I mentioned in the book, the particular lessons that I've learned from Professor Azizi in there. So I'll try to get to some of the mentioned points one by one. I'm very fascinated by. So let me start with this. I love the way you sort of pose the problem of the biography, because I think when you spend hours studying sort of anybody's life, you will end up getting, that doesn't matter how evil you think the person is, you start getting some level of sort of human sort of sympathy at some levels. I don't, I of course don't believe sort of in impartiality as a sort of good Marxist. So I mean, I think, if someone asks me, of course I think Soleimani was a bad guy, and if we have a good or evil, I certainly consider him evil in this way. Of course, one writes biographies because one thinks that the good or evil are not adequate. But I definitely had a very negative view of him, and that meant ever more I tried to, in order to be fair, to also sort of put myself in his shoes in different positions and think about, as you mentioned brilliantly early on, how is it that a young boy from Kerman, where my mother is also from, and I have sort of personal connections, comes to be a general that is feared around the world. And the question of biography and how much you talk about a man's life and how much about the effects and that he had is also important. There are some critics of the book have said, for example, that there are entire chapters when I don't mention him. For example, the chapters on Hezbollah, but I saw that as a necessary sort of backstory. On the particular questions of the impact of Soleimani domestically, I very much agree with what you were saying at the end of your sort of the question that you posed of the prices that the Iranian people had to pay for the policies that Soleimani followed, and so on. And that's one direct sort of role that he had on domestic policy, and what it meant. What has this shadow government, if you will, appointment of Soleimani as Quds commander as Khatami becomes president, and in the last 20-something years. In fact, it's one of the hardest questions, really. One of the hardest, most difficult things in a study of Iran for me has always been how to study, how to explain the differences in the regime and how to explain the different policies that are followed. Because after all, yes, Soleimani was appointed a few days after Khatami's sort of conversation with Christian Amanpour, but he also a short while after was collaborating with the Americans against Taliban, as I said, which seemed to be in line with President sort of Khatami's policy. And of course, I believe that there are different factions of the regime, and as your brilliant recent book shows, there are, it's possible to follow these careers to also find out different sorts of sociological factions. But the question of how they relate to each other and how they understand each other and how they sometimes come to defense of each other while they follow different policies is fascinating. For example, you would think that Zarif should really sort of hate Soleimani at some point because his actions are directly contravening him, and he definitely did at times. But not just for the public, but when you talk to some of the foreign policy diplomats, they also appreciated him in different ways. So I would say I have tried to portray these dualities of the Iranian government, and it's really not just dualities actually of different factions and simultaneous policies that are followed, which I also attribute to a bit to the reality that Ayatollah Khamenei is capable of the cakeism, as a new term, basically having his cake and eat it too. He wants to have their annual Death to America rally, but also to indulge death with Americans. He wants to be a great revolutionary, but he also wants to sort of open diplomatic openings. And I've tried to explain as well this, but will always strive to do better. And I'll consider that as one of the hardest challenges on writing about this period. On the particular excellent questions that you raised, so I think I very briefly do mention in the book, I hope that I do, I have in sort of other places, that when the Quds Force was founded in 1988, 1989, there was sort of a division of labor between the Quds Force and the Ministry of Intelligence. The Ministry of Intelligence was to lead the basically external assassinations of Sharaf Kandi, of other figures that you mentioned. Although the Ministry of Intelligence also got the help of Hezbollah in many of these actions and Hezbollah operatives. Wahidi was the commander of Quds Force in that period, not Soleimani. And as you know, the assassinations kind of come to an end in the early 90s before Soleimani's appointment, after Iran gets convicted in the Mykonos case. And they basically consider that to be very dangerous. I have written an op-ed recently in New York Times about the fact that I did a very worrying observation. In this New York Times piece, it's very short, obviously, but I go to a bit of a history, but also a very worrying observation that it seems to be coming back, in effect. The policy of kidnapping and killing basically opponents abroad, which Iran has done, more than most in history, in recent history. One of the strange, the other government that has done it strange enough is Yugoslavia in a way, because they also did a lot of external assassinations of well, a lot of them were fascist, the ones that Yugoslavs were killed. So usually there's more sympathy toward what they were doing. At any rate, so I believe Quds Force was not, I believe the evidence that this is not Quds Force's file. And I hope, and if I haven't mentioned, I'll make sure to mention later, the Minister of Intelligence was in charge of this. For the other cases that are mentioned, I had I'll start with, so the three questions were raised about whether Soleimani was there or not. Number one, I have to say, I tend to be on the conservative side when it comes to a book like this. So my main sources are the ones, historical documents that I can find, and also interviews that I've done with sort of Quds Force members, and sort of, in case of Soleimani's meeting with Putin, Russian analysts, who sort of Russian advisors to Putin who accompanied him in the meeting, and people that say a lot of tall tales. And I've always been on the conservative side in sort of believing and not believing. And there at some point is a judgment. For example, I evaluated that the Quds Force commander claimed that Soleimani had ordered the killing of Hadi seemed to believable, because there was some other evidence that pointed to that, and also it chimed in with what we know about the Soleimani-Houthi relationship. But for example, the claim that he had gone to Gaza in the middle of the sort of war when Israel was attacking Gaza, that he had gone in and out of Gaza, I just couldn't believe. I just couldn't see that he would do that. So with the other ones that you mentioned, for the Khobar bombing in 1996, it really requires a book of its own. I think it's very likely that Iran in some way was involved. Of course, Soleimani at that point didn't do anything with that area, right? He was involved in the eastern areas, and he was in the Quds Force and commanded sort of. So, but even the very fact of Iran's sort of involvement and to what level really it's a project that needs to happen on its own. Same is, of course, true with Rafiq Hariri's bombing in 2005. As you know, this was the subject of a big international investigation, which recently, after the book came out, the result of the investigation came out and pointed the finger of a member of the Hezbollah. Also, you know, when you write a book like this, it's the choice of, you know, which particular files you can sort of follow and go after. I sort of couldn't do that with Rafiq Hariri's killing, you know, and what role Soleimani had in it. Basically, I didn't find any evidence that he had. Of course, any evidence was very hardly guarded by people like Hezbollah and them. So I hope that different investigative journalists and others can later find that out. And of course, when the files open up, that's a great historian thing. We like to just know about things 30, 40 years after. There's the reason I left journalism for academia after all, because we can sort of wait. We can finally do the 1990s this year. And on the Baluch question, I think you have a very, very important sort of point there. I really wrote that with a dast larzan, as we say in Persian, with a shaking hand, because it's a very difficult period to write of Soleimani's operations on that area. So I talked to people in that area. I talked to sort of different Baluchi organizations and people who work on that history. And the pictures were from sort of really angel to monster and nothing in between. Either Soleimani was a sort of brutal drug dealer who was killing everybody, and you know, and his opponents were great sort of heroes of the mountains, Robin Hood-like figures of the mountains, or the opposite, basically, right? Or he was, you know, he really brought peace to the area. And of course, it's not hard to see that versions of both can be true. I.e., Soleimani did, you know, he helped. What we know is that he did brought a state sort of a state rule to that area more than it existed before. And you know, there are roads. People who built roads in that area were able to do so only after these operations. Now, did he sort of commit human rights violations while doing it? Is it, you know, I think it's a question of center-periphery relations in general also, right? You know, how do we view an area like Baluchistan that has been always ignored and oppressed by central government? And today it's a very timely reminder. In Saravan, we see it's actually fascinating. Even some people who are critical of the regime. So what we had in Saravan recently happened was that a number of people who basically move fuel across the borders to make a living for their families were killed. And people even critical of the regime in the center speak very almost positively of IRGC's brutal killing of people who were making a living. And even the MP for that area spoke positively of them. So I think this is the difficulty of writing the center to periphery relations. I think it's clear where my sympathies are, but I try to explain why Soleimani gained these skills. And here I'll wrap up the answer by a point that addresses both of them, is that one of the big weaknesses that I have is that I'm not a military historian. And, you know, I read thousands of really pages about the Iran-Iraq war, for example. I listened to the radio, you know, you can listen to the radio files of these people talking to each other on the command, but, you know, there is much I sort of can understand. For example, there's actually a big debate of how good of a commander Soleimani was in the Iran-Iraq war within the IRGC. And there are articles in IRGC websites of IRGC members writing to say, actually, he wasn't that good. It's actually surprising that this is allowed, but it's sort of, you know, it's advanced military stuff. So I would have limited ability to sort of judge his military qualities at different points. But a couple of things that I can say is that, of course, how much of a positive role he had, you know, doesn't, you know, you can be a brilliant general, but, you know, do it for the wrong purposes, basically, right? For the serving of the politics. And I was fascinated by the relationship between politics and military, writing the book of Khamenei and Soleimani, which I think could be a subject to a study. I gained a more complex understanding of this relationship. It was clear that Soleimani was a military geek almost, right? He loved the military stuff. He, for example, examples that I knew, like he knew all the Israeli drone companies, you know, he knew who works where, and but he, unlike what people said, he wasn't a very educated guy politically in a way. It looks like most books that he read were very technical or related to the stories of Iran-Iraq war, or he liked old books, like, you know, he would read Hafez poetry, or sort of, he would read, you know, because he never went to college, as you said, right? So he wasn't this great political mind in a way. He wasn't this great political mind in a way, but he was a very important military person. And this relationship was interesting because he had a personal loyalty to Khamenei, and he carried the sort of orders of Khamenei, but also the kind of, and this is what I say, interesting thing about relationship between military and politics, the kind of advice, the kind of options that he brought to Khamenei really mattered. So there was a sort of a dynamic relationship. And your point about what the following of these policies has really meant for Iran and Iran's security are very valid. And you know, what has meant. But for the Islamic Republic, I think it's not hard to see that this policy has also had benefits, while it also has endangered it. And we are very much in the middle of this game. I think it would be easier to know this in a few years. I'll end at the very end. I'll say that as for ISIS, in fact, you're very spot on here. I think, again, I mentioned in the book that if you know who believed that Soleimani had a role in rise of ISIS, analysts of Iran's Ministry of Intelligence. They have in these new files that were revealed by Intercept and New York Times, and I had the opportunity to look at some of these files. They very clearly say, the analysts of the Ministry of Intelligence blame Soleimani's policies of sectarian policies that he had helped follow in Iraq on the latest rise of ISIS. And the attack of ISIS on the Tehran parliament is a breach of sort of domestic security, I think. So it's probably, they're more to blame. And as with Israel, the Israeli attacks on the Iranians in Syria is sort of with the agreement of Russia, and it certainly shows a problem in sort of Soleimani's strategies. But perhaps even more fascinating are the way Israel in the last 10 years has stolen Iran's nuclear archives and killed sort of Iranian military figures, even the highly guarded ones. It's obviously it shows that IRGC, despite all these claims, it's not really good at doing its most basic job. I mean, you know, can you imagine Iran ever being able to kill Aviv Kochavi in Israel in an operation? I think it's clear. I mean, it's sort of an incredible thing that you're able to kill all your highly guarded persons with a country like Israel that has very few links to Iran, but they're able to do it. So I think this is mostly failings of domestic security in Iran. And I'll stop it here, and yeah, we can continue as thank you so much again, Professor Boroujerdi.
There are a series of questions, Arash, on the process of research and writing the book, which I was hoping that you would address early on. But the questions are very specific. There are questions about the sources. So you are not a military historian, but you are a historian. And I know that this book is a very contemporary book, but in terms of either archives or, so if I'm correct, I hear you saying that you did sort of oral history or interviews. What were the setup of the interviews? What was the timeline of the research? These are the questions that are asked. What are the documents that you had access to? And I have an impression that some of these questions are asked by younger scholars, or maybe PhD students in your situation who are interested in learning, or at least knowing where some of the sources are.
Basically, you call these people and they pick up, as amazing as it is, because there are dozens of different websites in Persian every day who interview with these people on different matters, and they share them. So they did so in some cases. They did so. Ramazan Sharif, for example, the IRGC spokesperson that I've interviewed on many occasions, I call his phone and he picks up. And you know, I usually use it for Al Monitor or sort of different English language courses. In this case, I said that it was for a longer project than a book, and sort of he collaborated. Then there, you know, I've had a journalistic relationship, if you will, with, I can say this one, actually, President Ahmadinejad, as many, I've former President of Iran, Ahmadinejad, I've done interviews with him publicly. Now, of course, he was in the opposition during the Rouhani's government, and I've worked for opposition TV channels. But there were points of news that he sort of, the documents that he had from Iran, or the points that he had on Rouhani government. So he tried, not just me, of course, BBC Persian and others, he sort of tried to share this information, again, for his own purpose. People like President Ahmadinejad, and others, do speak frequently with opposition journalists, and I'm not a sort of exception in this case. And as for the Quds Force commanders, it's a similar story. But at no point did they share anything that was really that security sensitive. They really share accounts, and they do so. It's not actually that unusual with Reuters and others. But the setup was Skype, basically. They're all Skype interviews. None of them were in person. None of them. With the Russian ones, it was in person in Europe, but the Iranian ones were all over Skype. I'll leave it at that for now.
Sure, great. Mehrzad, do you happen to have any comments? Or
I just want to say something about this interviews, Arash. Of course, your interviews have added a lot of, texture and detail to the narrative you provide. But here is a suggestion I have in case you think it's acceptable. I mean, you basically refer to these interviews just by saying, interview with the author, right? From such and such, and in many occasions you don't even tell us, what the credential of that person is. I think, again, the audience, the reader, would like to hear from you, not necessarily revealing the information about the identity of the person, but some help from you as to what was the position of this person, or is the narrative believable or not? Because right now we have no way of judging, right, what these have they say. And besides, again, if these interviews were completed after his assassination, right, one also has to account for the bias of sympathy, right? And people's memories, etc., are not necessarily always that reliable there. So I think if you were to contextualize it, the interviews a bit, that can also help the reader. For example, I just point one issue. You have a memorable line where you say Qassem Soleimani meets with Bashar al-Assad, right? And you say, basically, Soleimani tells him, Mr. Assad, fight or flight, right? You want to fight or do you want to leave? Tell me whichever you want, and I will make that possible for you. If you want to leave, we will take you to Iran or Russia or whatever. If you want to fight, we will help you. Okay, and you go on based on that saying, Bashar al-Assad was intimidated to this day by Qassem Soleimani, right? Okay, that's a very colorful anecdote, but again, I don't know, how should I accept it, having no basis for, being able to check the veracity of it.
Thank you very much. Yes, so and also I see that Dr. Alamzadeh also sort of asked this question about the Quds Force members. I'd say that to clarify something is that some of them are not actually after the writing of the book, although I read them, if that makes sense. So I had done this as a journalist before, and I sort of talked with them again. So the date shows the later date, but the original information was earlier. And unfortunately, they didn't agree to reveal more of their positions, right? So, but none of them are sort of high commands. But one thing that I should do better, and I hope to be able to do this in later editions, is to make clear the chain of sourcing and information. That's unfortunately an issue that I need a few more months to sort of also add more sources. There are actually a lot more sort of references, footnotes that I could have had that unfortunately without time I couldn't do, and to show the chain of transmission. For example, the Assad-Soleimani meeting, there is more than one sort of retelling of it. And, the Russians sort of had an account at this meeting. So sort of a Russian source that I had said this. It is also basically said in a bit of different versions, in both official versions on in Iran. This story is told, which of course it's sort of good for Soleimani. But even the Syrian one, it doesn't say that fight or flight, but it confirms the dates and the meeting and the kind of relationship that and that they had. So, but there is always, I think this is the difficulty of oral history and of the tales, the very tall tales that people tell, that really, I really included a small percentage of it, and that is hard to, especially with a figure like Soleimani, right? Which is very revered by many of these people that I interviewed. For example, if you talk to the Iranians or actually Afghans that I've interviewed, Afghans who had a history of fighting Soviet Union, you know, Soleimani meets Putin and Soleimani tells him, this is the way you have to run the world. And Putin just looks so, which was sort of obviously not true. So I think this is a difficulty, but I'll try to sort of make the transition better and explain better where's the source of it.
One other suggestion, Arash, speaking of the Afghan and Pakistani volunteers, whatever, that he mobilized for those fights. Again, if you look at the Iranian papers, there have been some fascinating reports written on the ones who died in the battlefields of Syria. You know, for example, they go and talk to their wives or their children as to the reasons why these people signed up. And for example, you see, you know, whether it was a combination of getting their papers in order to be able to stay in Iran for good, it was, you know, financial resources, allowing their kids to go to school, et cetera, et cetera. There are really some fascinating explanation there that if you were to, you know, revise a second edition, again, talking about the transnational ties, bringing the Afghan and the Pakistanis into this picture of Fatimiyun and Zainabiyun, you know, brigades, I think will be very interesting.
If anyone in the audience want to just speak your mind, unmute yourself, and you have comments or questions, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for this discussion. I have two questions. One is with Ahmadinejad, and because you said you interviewed him, can you clarify? Did he say that he wants to destroy Israel, or he wants to destroy Israel as an apartheid? Because that makes all the difference. And I think he said the latter, not the former. That's the first question. The second question is, after the assassination of Soleimani, do you think that the Iranian regime will switch to a more distributed chain of command versus a central figure, central hero, in terms of like as Soleimani was? And do you think that, which of the two models you think works better for the Iranian people to have faith or to trust the leadership and the integrity of the operations, etc.?
So Ahmadinejad, I mean, the Israel question is discussed extensively elsewhere. He said that he wants Israel to disappear from the face of time, as Sahneh Ruzegar Mehrzad. But it's very clear the Iranian regime is very open about openly genocidal intentions about Israel. So no, it's not about a political change in Israel. It says that it wants to kill everybody in Tel Aviv and Haifa and drop bombs on them and kill everybody. And they say this very regularly. So, you know, I've also written about the recent poster in which they published using the word final solution, in which there are almost no Palestinians actually pictured. So the way Iran talks about Israel, you know, the Iranian leadership talks about Israel, it's not about sort of Palestinian rights and the just full struggle against the Israeli apartheid. So I think that much is clear. Now, President Ahmadinejad has also said other things, at other points, including that he wants friendship between Iran and Israel. But well, he didn't actually say that, but his close advisor said. But you know, he is known to, you know, not unlike former President Donald Trump, he's not unknown to say many different things to different audiences and try to ruffle feathers in any way that he can. But I think it's clear that the type of policies that Iran advocates against Israel are aggressive and they're very open. As I said, they regularly say, you know, we should kill it, you know, we should destroy Tel Aviv and Haifa and other parts. So I think that's clear. And as for I think after Soleimani's death, Ismail Qaani has had basically, the longest story short is that now that it's more than a year, I can say with some confidence, they've basically decided that Qaani is not going to be Soleimani. No one can be Soleimani. So he is indeed more of a coordinator. And I think it was offered, the idea was broached that maybe Hassan Nasrallah can play the role of the new Qassem Soleimani. He becomes the head of the impressive transnational army that Soleimani had. But I think from the evidence, it looks like Nasrallah basically said, you know, I have a job already, which is Secretary General of Hezbollah, which is no small job. So I can't part-time as a chair of the whole thing, which, maybe some of the colleagues who have to work between assignments can appreciate. But at any rate, so I think the decision in Iran is that they're going to have more of a coordinator at the top and not a figure like Soleimani, who was able to move across everywhere. And really, it's not a job that you can just easily have. And the way Soleimani was able to move between countries and have personal relationships across different countries.